institution's senior fellow, Victor Davis Hanson, talks about the father of us all, his latest book of essays on war and history. Capitola Book Cafe in Capitola, California, is the host of this event. It's an hour, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for coming out on a Sunday night in Santa Cruz. This isn't a Santa Cruz topic, war and conflict. But nevertheless, here we are. And I thought what I'd do is speak for about 35 minutes and then welcome as many questions as we can get in. These are essays that I wrote. Some have over the last decade. Some are quite new and have never been published. And they have one theme, and that is, whereas human nature is unchanging throughout the millennia, warfare itself is mistakenly thought to change every decade. In fact, I try to argue the theme of the book is that I don't think wars change much at all. Sort of like my grandfather used to tell me on the farm that I could push a button and get 1,500 gallons of water. He had to hand crank a pump and get 3 gallons of water. But he turned to me once and said, the water hasn't changed any. The essence hasn't, just the delivery system. And the same is true of high-tech warfare. Because it's a human enterprise and human nature remains constant through the centuries, the same principles apply, and therefore it's valuable. We don't like to study military history today. In fact, we can look at a lot of studies. There are about 200 peace and conflict resolution programs in the United States, and I think there's 5 or 6 formal military history programs. About 1.8% of all professors identify themselves as military historians. Now, why is that? Part of it is the post-Vietnam 60s generation, where we had a new concept in the West. Whereas before, from the Greeks onward, people objected to particular wars, but not necessarily war itself. I guess I could use that phrase. Some people thought no matter how horrific war was, there was a certain utility. After all, it could end things like Nazism, Italian fascism, Japanese militarism, chattel slavery, or the threat of war could stop something like Stalinism. But after Vietnam, and also in the nuclear age where war had raised the specter of complete Armageddon, people objected to the idea of war. No longer would they agree with the Greeks that the Persian War was good. They were attacked, they were defending Eleutheria or their freedom. Peloponnesian War was bad because Greeks were killing each other. First Punic War was understandable, Third Punic War was bad. But we have sort of jettisoned that idea. And in the modern or postmodern 21st century, we have this idea that all war is bad. That's another reason why we don't study military history too often. Why should we? Because in most bookstores there's a section military history, and believe me, it's got more books than race, class, and gender section. It's got more than farming. It's got more even than environmentalism. So the public has this macabre interest in warfare. Why should, though, we formally study war? And I think I'll have to go back to the Greeks for 2 or 3 reasons. We should remember that history, historia, meant inquiry. But de facto it meant inquiry about war. So almost every history that the ancients wrote, who started the formal discipline of history, was about war. Herodotus and the Persian Wars, Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars, Xenophon's 4th century wars and the end of the Peloponnesian War, Polybius and the Punic Wars, Livy and the Punic. We could go on and on and on. And note what a theme throughout all of these histories are. Unlike us, they believe that not all events were equal. We're sort of in a relativism, a period of relativism where we don't want to adjudicate one event as being any more or less serious or important or memorable than another. Not so the Greeks. Every time you start a Greek history, whether it's Herodotus or Thucydides or Xenophon, they tell you why their war is more important than somebody else's war. And they have various criteria. So many people were affected, cities were changed, governments fell. But there's one common theme, and that is war itself is more important than other events. It's almost as if time and space are collapsed, so that people who are very young and have a long period of their lives to live give it up. And that's an aberration. Herodotus says the thing about war is fathers bury sons. It shouldn't happen. And so if we could make the Greeks come alive, they would say, yes, 1939 is more important than 1929. even with the Depression. 1944 was a more important year than 1947. 1918 was a more important year than 1911. By virtue of these cataclysmic wars that changed people's lives and events rippled out from them as never before. So one reason that we should study military history, I think, is because we could go back to the ancient idea that events are different in war. That's when revolutions take place. That's when technology explodes. That's when ideas appear and disappear at rapid speed, unlike peacetime. A second is a moral issue. I was driving over here today to the coast from the valley and past the cemetery, and I think today we're in danger because we have divorced ourselves from our military past. It's not that our young people do not know what Gettysburg is, or they don't know what the Bulge is, or they don't know what Normandy Beach is. They don't know what World War II is. They do not know what Civil War is. Much less would they know what Okinawa or Iwo Jima or Belleau Wood is. They have almost complete amnesia about all of the 18, 20-year-olds, 23-year-olds who died so that they could have takeout pizza and watch Oprah, to be crass about it. So a society that has no sense of commemoration and has no idea that the singular exceptional nature of their own culture is dependent or hinged on thousands of people who were willing to die for the idea of the United States, it seems to me that it's a very amoral thing to do for an entire generation not to have any commemoration of events in the past when a lot of people wage their all for us to live in relative peace. And then a third, of course, is it's didactic. War can teach us about the present wars and, more importantly, the future wars. It doesn't mean that history repeats itself exactly, but as long as you predicate that premise on the idea that human nature doesn't change, then war in the past will be of some didactic value, as Thucydides said, of teaching us about conflict in the present. That's a very controversial statement, and I discussed that in one of the essays. I had a debate once where a person from a peace and conflict resolution program got very angry and said that human nature had changed. And I asked him to what degree. Maybe it was brain chemistry through video games or increased nutrition, or perhaps we're indoor people. Something had accelerated this Darwinian process so that we're kinder, gentler folk, and we're not subject to these age-old appetites and impulses. But he couldn't adduce any proof for any of that, and as we speak, there are about 15 wars going on worldwide. More people have been killed after World War II than during World War II. And so if we study wars of the past, then maybe we can have some notion about how to ameliorate their severity, that is, prevent them from being all destructive. And that's the last point that I want to take off now and just walk us through some of the essays in the book in a chronological fashion about war in general. What starts them? What makes them actually break out? How do they evolve? How do they end? And what we can learn from them. First thing that I think the modern mind is just intent on, wrongly, is to try to find a material reason for every war that breaks out. There has to be oil. When I was a student over here at Santa Cruz, everybody told me there was oil off the shore of Vietnam, and that's why they were there. In Korea, there must have been oil off the shore of Korea. But so often, the study of wars in the past show us that there's almost no material reason. There can be, but believe me, Germany, for example, has about 3 million people more than it did in 1939, and it's got about 20% less territory. Does any German talk about Lebensraum today? Do you hear the Germans saying, if we just don't have Poland, we can't survive? You don't hear it. I know that the Falklands was a silly war. Borges, the great novelist, said 2 bald-headed men were fighting over a comb. But if you think about it, there may be some oil off there, but that was not about material resources. The Japanese are quite successful today without resurrecting the co-prosperity sphere. Saddam Hussein has all the oil. He had all the oil in the world without going into Kuwait. And Iran today has 200 years of natural gas reserves. There's no reason why they need nuclear power. They need nuclear power about as much as North Korea does, whose people were eating grass just a decade ago. But if we go back to study wars in the past, we start to see some disturbing trends. That they tend to be about perceptions of honor, perceptions of fear, perceptions of self-interest, irrational appetites and motivations. And so Germans had convinced themselves by 1939 that they had to prove something to themselves, to the Poles, to the Czechs, to the British, to the French. Saddam Hussein was furious that he had fought the Iranians while the Kuwaitis watched him, and he felt that he was bearing the burden of Sunni Arab nationalism fervor against these Persian Shiites, and the Kuwaitis were just sitting there and not helping them. I don't know what the Falklands was about, but it had a lot to do with an unpopular dictatorship in Argentina that whipped up popular fervor over the so-called Malvinas, and in turn the British had the reputation of the British Navy going all the way back to Lord Nelson. And so that was a war of honor. And most of them are. Sometimes you look at the 30 or 40 wars in the Greek 5th century, and they do break out usually over land. But a very interesting thing becomes apparent. The land's worthless. It's usually the borderland from Thebes or Athens or Argos of Sparta. One side could very logically say, let's have a United Nations, let's have enlightened people discuss this, let's divide it 50-50. Maybe we could take the Falklands and have East Falkland Island, West Falkland Island, and everybody can get along. But people aren't that way. Think for a minute, if any of you live in the suburbs, when I was writing this book, I came across a lot of interesting articles I was looking for about human interest stories, about suburban fighting. You'd be surprised the number of homeowners get in feuds with their neighbors over things like leaves blowing onto their lawn. And some of these escalate to a level of physical violence. Anybody who's an outsider looks at this and said, why would people who have $500,000 in investment worry about whether 3 or 4 leaves keep blowing on, or a root goes under somebody's driveway, or a dog barks on Sunday? Because they become manifested as perceptions of honor or pride or seriousness or perceived self-interest. And I think that's what we have to remind ourselves so often, that logical, rational nations will do illogical things. Russia did not have to go into South Ossetia. There's no reason for it. Does anybody think today that China needs more people, or rocky Taiwan, or it can't survive? What in the world is that about? Why are they so paranoid about Taiwan? Makes no sense at all. If you go and look at the Greeks and the Turks fighting over the Aegean, some of these islands are not very fertile. But they're very fertile in the imaginations of millions of people and their sense of self-worth. So I think that's a good thing that we can remember about war. I say good because that can instruct us on what to look out for, and do not expect everybody to be logical, because nations are just conglomerations of people. People are irrational and infantile and emotional. Well, everybody has disagreements. What makes them actually go to the next stage of pulling the trigger and devolving into organized violence? The suburbanites that fight over the leaves blowing necessarily don't go have fist fights. That's an oddity. I wish I could tell you that the two suburbanites don't fight when their leaves are blowing on one side or the other of the boundary line, because they're rational people and they've discussed it and they've decided to agree to disagree. Or they've talked to the neighborhood suburban homeowners association and they've given a ruling. Often that's not the case. Often somebody is prominent in the community, or somebody works for the post office, and they know that if they get caught beating somebody and get a felony arrest, they're going to lose their job, or they're going to shame their family. In other words, there is a deterrent. That sounds so Neanderthal, as if our limbic brains have not evolved over that, beyond that idea of deterrence. But let's go back to some of those events that made no sense. The Falklands. Why did they invade when they did? Probably because the British had symbolically withdrawn one submarine tender. Probably because a few people in Parliament had thought, as a part of reaching out, they would use the word Malvinas instead of the Falklands. Probably because a new prime minister was female, and in the machismo culture of Argentine politics, they thought that she would be weak. And fat chance they didn't know it was Margaret Thatcher. But in any case, the sense of deterrence was lost, and that made Mad Dog Mendez and the Argentinians take a chance that they otherwise, by rational analysis, would not have taken. Why did Saddam Hussein go into Kuwait? It made no sense. I mean, the United States and our allies can fight wars where there's no obstructions, flat terrain, we had supplies. It was just almost lunatic, suicidal even. And the answer is that he probably thought that an inadvertent remark from an American ambassador, April Gillespie, had said reportedly that the territorial dispute between Kuwait and Iraq was of no interest or little interest to the United States, and he felt that nobody would say things. Why did Hitler go into Poland in September 1939? Why, he would say, why didn't I? He was one of the most shocked people in the world that that actually started a war. You read Mr. Goebbels and what other commentators inside the Reich said. Why did they want to go over Poland? They didn't go over to war over Czechoslovakia. They didn't care about Silesia. They didn't care about the Anschluss. They did not care about the Rhineland. They didn't care about any of these things. They didn't care that we broke all of these post-World War I agreements. And so the sense of deterrence had been lost. And when you lose the sense of deterrence, then that invites people to take risks that they otherwise would not. And that's very, very important to remember, because every once in a while, very educated, enlightened people in the West feel that everybody can be on the same page. The promise of the Enlightenment is with enough education and learning and discussion, we can all think as if we're in the Harvard faculty lounge, or we're all in the Stanford Library having coffee or something. That's not true. There are going to be, from now till tomorrow, to the end of time, proverbial bad actors that will act if they think they have less to lose than not acting. And what checks them is not the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, unfortunately, but it's the fear of a bigger stick, or that they take the gamble, it will not be worth it. They may be irrational to want to take the gamble, but they're very rational in adjudicating whether it will succeed or not. A couple of things that when these wars then break out, I've noticed in the last decade that we've used words that are really neutral. Things like preemption, multilateralism, unilateralism, preventive warfare, and we've given a moral value to them. In other words, I think most people in the audience tonight would say, well, I'm supposed to think that unilateralism is bad and multilateralism is good. Preemption's always bad. But these are just empty concepts that are descriptive in nature. They've never been ethical. Think of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. That was the most multilateral coalition of the war. Everybody from Italians to Spanish to Hungarians to Romanians to Germans joined in to gang up on Russia. And had we had a unilateral preemptive strike against Hitler, let's say in June of 1939, there was far more infantry divisions on the Western Front among the Allies, especially France, than German. And they could have easily gone into great swaths of Western Germany had they preempted. So it's remembered that these terms that now have become so politically loaded throughout history have had no real value. Sometimes it's good to stop a bad guy by preempting him. Sometimes a bunch of bad guys that are in a coalition give multilateralism a bad name. One of the most unilateral states was whom? It was Churchill's England in 1939. It was all by itself. It unilaterally was taking on Germany, Italy, and most of Eastern Europe. Another thing that happens in war, and I'm trying to reflect essays in the book, is that this notion of military error, and that came up again in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think it's a symptom, again, of a postmodern society that is used to things working and working very well and very rapidly. You have 500 channels on your television set. You can call Kenya tonight on a cell phone. We go home, we can find out anything, any bit of information in the world on the internet in 0.2 seconds. And therefore we extend that assurance to war itself. So when we go to war, which is what? The stuff of the unpredictable, emotion, young people. Most people don't let their 18-year-olds drive their family car, much less put them on a deck and guide a $120 million plane into a parking stall. So you have youth, you have stress, you have emotions, and things happen that we don't anticipate in war. But our generation, used to this peacetime surety that everything must work and we must be comfortable and we are affluent and leisure, have lost any sight, especially with the dearth of military history, that has never been the case in any war. So we had a national outcry, as we should, over lack of up-armored Humvees. We had a national outcry over supposedly insufficient body armor. What we didn't have a national outcry was, wait a minute, these are lapses. We always have lapses in war. What we do when we have lapses in war, we discuss them, and then we enter a cycle of response, counter-response, and we have to beat the enemy in this cycle. Therefore, we will get up-armored and get better body armor and drone surveillance and better counterinsurgency and better intelligence to stop the IED before the IED gets shaped charges from Iran and blows up the MRAP or the Rhino or the improved armored Humvee, and it sort of goes around and around. And the side that, not the side that doesn't make any errors, everybody makes errors, but the side that reacts to them the most quickly and the most calmly wins, as that happened in Iraq. Think for a minute. I was shocked when I would read in the New York Times all of these supposedly nefarious people who didn't have up-armored Humvees. And I thought, why would they? A Humvee was always sort of a beefed-up Jeep. It was behind-the-lines transportation. Nobody could anticipate, as nobody ever anticipates before a war, the nature of the actual fighting. Nobody understood there would be no fronts once the insurgency started, and Humvees would be on the front lines. The key then was to react to it. Think for a minute the Normandy campaign of June 1944. The Americans and the British and the SHAEF planners knew almost every minutia about the wind velocity and direction for the landing. They knew the water currents, they knew the water temperature, they knew the size of the sand on the beach. Everything was planned. It took a year to plan. It was one of the most brilliant campaigns, less than 3,500 dead on D-Day, and it was the largest invasion of Europe since Xerxes in 480. It was brilliant. They got an entire army, several corps on the beach and ready to go to Berlin. And then what happened? They basically stayed from June 6th to the end of July. 6 weeks and they didn't move. Why? Because somebody had not done a little research and discovered that on the other side of Omaha Beach was something called the hedgerows and the bocage. And these were ideal for defensive troops with superior anti-tank weapons, dug-in Panther tanks, sophisticated warriors from the Eastern Front that were dug in, and we lost 80,000 casualties before we broke out. And how do we break out? Cobra. Now we can call it Cobra 1 because we've used it for Cobra 2 in Iraq. We used B-17s as a tactical bombing weapon. And what did we do? We killed dozens of Americans and wounded well over 100. And then once we decided it's not smart to bomb perpendicular to our own lines, we did it again with the benefit of hindsight, and we killed more Americans. In other words, to break out of Normandy Beach, we had to kill a lot of Americans in a horrific accident. And we killed the highest-ranking general on the European front, Leslie McNair, a 3-star general. More importantly, we lost several hundred in exercises leading up to D-Day. And that generation had grown up, during the Depression. They wanted a nice steak. They usually had to get their hands quite bloody to kill it. They didn't really all have flush toilets. And their way of thinking, life is nothing but tragedy and error, and the side wins that will overcome it the most rapidly. Not our generation. It's very, very hard for us to accept that tragic view of the world when most of our lives are therapeutic in nature. With enough money, with enough leisure, with enough education, with enough technology, we can control every facet of a war. And that's what we try to do. A couple more things, and I just want to finish by talking about how these wars end. One of the things that I've written about in the past is that the West, with its emphasis on constitutional government, individual freedom, separation of religion and government, this triumph of secular rationalism, creates high technology, superior military discipline. And all things being equal, it can project military power in ways that its adversaries cannot. Doesn't mean there's not going to be a little Bighorn or Isla Wanda. There is always going to be setbacks. But smaller numbers of troops farther away from home can exercise military power in a way that its adversaries or enemies usually don't. There's a reason why the Zulus are not in the Thames and the British in 1879 are in Africa. There's a reason why Montezuma does not sail into Barcelona. There's a reason why indigenous peoples were not able to kill as many Americans in their frontier fighting than were lost in one or two battles of the Civil War. There's a reason why Britain lost more people in the Battle of the Somme than it had in an entire century of colonial fighting. And this is called Western warfare, if you will. But in our time and space, what's very interesting is the way that we're checking it now. How people are checking it in Afghanistan, checking it in Iraq, checking it in Somalia. And they're doing it in the exact way that people check Greek hoplites and Roman legionnaires and crusaders for the last 2,500 years. First thing to remember is Westerners tend to be going further from home with tenuous logistics, and they tend to have a higher standard of living. It just is. England, even in the Dark Ages, had a higher standard of living than Africa or the New World, probably. The Greeks, you had to ask an Athenian warrior to go into Aetolia. It was a much higher standard of living in Athens than a tribal backwater of Greece. And that means this notion of asymmetry starts to take place. If you have a helicopter pilot and he's emailing his child and his wife from a suburban home in the United States, he's a beneficiary of a $250,000 education, he's in a $3 million Apache, and one of 11 children shoots him down with an accidental shot from an RPG in Ramadi, and that falls. In moral, ethical terms, the loss is equal. But this society, being leisured and affluent, will interpret that loss of the BA, the major, the emailing the kids, the suburban existence, and it will be more grievous to their cause than Iraq will, given that life is often nasty, brutal, solitary, and short in Iraq. So one of the ways that you check Western dynamism is you create situations where the affluent intruder, invader, is made by this process of asymmetrical warfare, is made to feel the losses far more than the people who were less affluent. Another is that there's not really a concept of a unified West. Think of the Ottomans. They were very successful because Europe was trisected between Ottomanism, Catholicism, and Protestantism. And that has not changed. On the eve of the 2003 war, you could make the argument that Russia and France signed some of the most lucrative oil deals with Saddam. Were very vehement in their opposition to the United States at the UN. And as we speak of the West today, it's not just trisected, it's fragmented. And one of the ways that you can defeat a Western power that has more sophisticated technology is ally yourself with, if you're the Ottomans and you want to fight at Lepanto, well then start harboring your ships, your galleys at Toulon, because the French are not necessarily in line with the Papal States or Spain or Venice. Another thing that you can do is a consensual society is based on self-critique. Long before we've ever heard of Cindy Sheehan or Michael Moore, there were people like Euripides and Aristophanes that made fun of war. And so anti-war movements, if the war is an optional war, if it's deemed not necessary, if it's deemed unending, Western peoples are very impatient. They want to get back to making money and enjoying the good life. And if you can draw a war out, then you have an enormous advantage as well. And finally, you can be, this sounds culturally chauvinistic, but you can be parasitical on technology. Just because you can create a sophisticated drone and you know how to repair it and you can design Predator 1, 2, 3 doesn't mean that the enemy can't get a hold of one and figure out how to use it. All the components to an IED come from the West. Just because somebody in Afghanistan doesn't know the physics of a garage door opener or a cell phone doesn't mean that he can't import them and cobble together from information on the internet a successful device that will be very successful in asymmetrical warfare. So what we're seeing in this particular century is the triumph of Western military dynamism, but for a variety of historical forces are checking its utility. It's a world of nuclear weapons, so we don't see as many conventional World War II Korea type struggles in the past. And I think increasingly it's going to be very hard for Westerners to use conventional military power given the expertise of asymmetrical warfare by people who choose to stop them. Finally, how do these wars end? And we have an axis of evil. Remember that ill-fated term? I think David Frum coined it. And in it was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Notice who wasn't in it. Germany, Vietnam, Japan. all enemies. Why weren't they in it? Well, whatever you think about the military efficacy of our effort in Vietnam, I think it was very good actually, but it was strategically inept. And we lost that war. What was the war for? It was to create a non-communist South that could evolve into something like South Korea. But for a variety of reasons that failed, the issue was adjudicated. It's now united under North Vietnamese communism. So they're no longer an enemy. They were not in the axis of evil. We all know the story with Japan and Germany and Italy. They weren't in the axis of evil. But think who was again. At the time Iraq was. We had fought the 1990-91 war. That was not resolved. We mistakenly thought the strategic aim had been to free Kuwait. Now the problem was that you had a dictator who had attacked 4 of his neighbors and had an uncanny ability of translating enormous petroleum wealth into sophisticated weaponry of all types. And that would endure and plague people as long as he was there. So that was a bellum interruptum, so to speak. And who else was in it? North Korea. I think it was kind of wise for Matthew Ridgway to suggest that once they had pushed the North Koreans and the Chinese communists back across the 38th parallel in March, April 1951, that we sort of stayed there. But a classical military historian would say, wait a minute, the issue was not resolved. You think the issue was the 38th parallel. The issue was whether you were going to stop Chinese expansionism and North Korean communism, which were antithetical to Western values in that particular part of the world. And so we have another bellum interruptum. So the grandchildren of the brave people who fought at the Yalu River or they fought at Incheon are now under the specter of a North Korean nuclear weapon. And finally, we had Iran. In some ways, you could say that the taking of the hostages in 1979 set off a series of events where Iran found itself in a cold, in a sort of lukewarm, and sometimes in a hot war with the United States, and that has not been adjudicated. So we're sort of in the situation the Romans were between Punic War I, Punic War II, Punic War III, that there's a timeout. If you're the Israelis and the Palestinians are their allies, you have 1947, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982, 2006, why each side takes their breath, starts to rearm, tries new tactics, tries to enlist new patrons and allies, especially now with the demise of the Soviet Union and its nuclear deterrent, and then they go at it again. And they will go at it forever, just like the Punic peoples and the Romans went at it forever, until one side wins and one side loses, and you have something like World War II or World War I or the Civil War. If you can imagine that terrible summer of 1864, after the Wilderness, the Crater, Cold Harbor, Jubal Early's raid on Washington, D.C., Lincoln was not only going to lose the election to McClellan, he was fighting a rebellion among Republicans with John C. Fremont, and he had Horace Greeley damning him every day, and he was just completely demoralized because people who have no real independent way of thinking or ideology, they follow the pulse of the battlefield. By 1864, the Army of the Potomac had almost been destroyed. And so it looked like the war was going to be return to the status before the conflict at Fort Sumner. And there would be two democratic entities. One would be slave only and one wouldn't. And then that would plague us for the next 150 years. And then Sherman takes Atlanta on September 2nd. He sends a message and says those famous 6 words, Atlanta is ours and fairly won, and then you can't find anybody who's not for Lincoln. And Lincoln has renewed public support, he ends the war. And that's what usually happens with these wars. They have to be decided militarily, and then you have to adjudicate the peace. And what else can we learn about military history? I'm afraid to say that it's not very encouraging about human nature, how it reacts to war, but it seems to be that if you want to guarantee another war, then be brutal to the enemy that you defeated and humiliated, or, just as dangerously, show magnanimity to an enemy that doesn't feel he's defeated. We all talk about Versailles as if it was a great injustice, but if you look at the terms at Versailles, it was not nearly as bad as what the Germans inflicted on the Russians in 1917, their peace treaty, or what the German General Staff had talked about in 1914 when they thought they were going to take Paris. No, the problem with Versailles was the German army was never beaten. The German army surrendered 50 to 60 miles inside France and Belgium. And so it walked back. It could have been defeated in 6 more weeks. Finally, after losing 2 million Allied soldiers and having 1 million Americans transported from April 1917 to summer 1918, we were making enormous strides. We were going to go through the Alsace-Lorraine, go into Germany, defeat the German army, occupy the German homeland, tell the Germans that it was nobody's fault but their own, they had been defeated, and then being magnanimous. Stay on and shepherd in some type of consensual government. We did not do that. And what happened? The Germans walked back and said, we've never had an enemy soldier, we never let an enemy soldier get into German territory, but we were stabbed in the back by Jews and communists. And as General Folk said, this Versailles is not a prescription for peace, it's a guarantee of war in 20 years. He was almost right to the year. So it seems that if we look at these wars, you cannot try to be magnanimous before the enemy is defeated. You have to defeat him, humiliate him, ensure that he knows he was defeated, it was his own fault, and then reach out and try to reconstruct society. That's going to be very difficult in our own postmodern society for a variety of reasons, because we have a moral stricture that we consider it very immoral, and rightly so, to inflict that level of violence on an enemy to make them cease and desist, and then be magnanimous. What we're more likely to do is be magnanimous before the enemy has even been defeated. And we saw that in the Iraqi war, where one day we were, at the end of 3 weeks, we had defeated Saddam, everybody was coward, it looked like we were going to win, and suddenly American soldiers were stringing telephone wire, they were painting schools, they were reaching out, and the enemy said, you know what, we're still here. We just dissolved, nobody's gone after us, we're looting, they don't do anything, and they went right back on the offensive. I think that's going to be very hard in wars of the future among Western populations, because for a variety of reasons, they're not willing to inflict a level of damage on an enemy to humiliate them with the expectation that then they can be constructive and help them get out of their, in a post-war depression, they can get out of it. I don't see that happening. It's going to be very, very problematic in the future. And we've seen it already in places as diverse as Somalia and Lebanon. Let me just finish with a final thought. Why does all this sound, some of you were frowning at me like I walked out of a lunatic asylum, but why does this seem so foreign to us and so repugnant to our sensibilities? And I think we get back to the promises of the 18th century French and British, Scottish Enlightenment, that we felt that we had finally reached a level of civilization in which capitalism, high technology, the arts of diplomacy, interconnectedness between nations had created a utopian sense that war was behind us. And for us to see these wars, they become a referendum on the Enlightenment. When they start to break out, we think, my gosh, the UN failed, or George Bush said dead or alive, or smoke them out, or bring them on, or somebody has to be blamed for a war. And rather than seeing these things as organic entities, and that, as Plato said, the natural order of things may be conflict rather than peace. Peace is a parenthesis. And what's very hard for us children of the Enlightenment to admit is that it's very hard to keep the peace. It takes constant vigilance, and peace is an aberration, a welcome aberration, but it's only a result of vigilance and deterrence. And when that proposition is presented to the American people or any affluent Western society, especially in Europe, they become very, very depressed and feel that the people who are bringing them that bad news in some ways are themselves morally suspect. And the result of that is we're going to have more wars than we can ever imagine unless we wise up and relearn the lessons that have been pretty much standard in the West since the Greeks. Thank you very much.
As I mentioned before, we will be recording, so if you have questions, please raise your hand and wait to ask your question until I give you the mic. And also, if we can ask everybody to be respectful of your time and of the time of the author and your fellow guests, we appreciate that. Question?
So you said that deterrence, when you lose deterrence, problems lie ahead. How does that figure in with Iran now that we're doing nothing, we just kind of never take any action, and we keep making threats, but we never back it up with anything, and they're getting more and more belligerent. So what do you see the future in that situation?
Well, I think that when I start to read public opinion commentary in the major newspapers by supporters of the administration using the word, we can contain Iran, that's a fait accompli. I think this administration has admitted that Iran is going to be nuclear, and that all the talk about the missing imam and wanting to annihilate Israel are just the stuff of nuclear poker, but they will be subject to the laws of deterrence. I think 90% of me thinks they will be subject to deterrence, but 10% says they won't. And if I was an Israeli, and I saw a recent poll that said 26% of Israelis would immigrate if Iran became nuclear. I think that's the idea behind it, that Iran wants to have a sword of Damocles, and every 6 or 8 weeks have Mr. Ahmadinejad or someone like him threaten to annihilate Israel and say, ha, just kidding, and then people are supposed to live under that situation. So it would be intolerable, and we have a bad choice and a worse choice. The tragedy, in my way of thinking, is we had a popular uprising last year, and I think that whereas George Bush would not have been the charismatic, globalized leader that could have galvanized support for the demonstrators, Barack Obama was. He could have really gone around the world and said, these people may not be wanting American-style democracy, but they are tired of theocracy, and we need to support them, and he voted present. And that was a great opportunity lost, because now we're stuck with the bad and the worst choice. If you use military operations to eliminate that, you're going to, I think, start a wave of terrorism, and Israel is going to be showered with missiles from Syria, from the West Bank, perhaps even from Iran. And if you don't, they're going to become nuclear, and that's going to perhaps lead to 2 or 3 Sunni Arab countries becoming nuclear. It's going to result in blackmail not only of Israel, but European countries as well. And so now we're in a proverbial bad and worse choice. And I think this particular administration is somewhat embarrassed because, as you said, they gave 4 deadlines. Remember, it was, you better stop this by the United Nations meeting in September of last year. You better stop this by the G20. You better stop this by the face-to-face negotiations. You better stop this by the first of the year. Nothing's worse than being loud and carrying a small stick. Yeah.
I have to leave in 15 minutes, but it's not a protest.
Yes.
Basically, I agree with you that the problem is human nature, for sure.
Yeah.
And the second problem is that people don't understand that. But my question is, you say warfare hasn't changed, but I want to suggest that the advent of robotic warfare more and more, in some sense, does change war and our relation to it.
Yes. Well, it does in the sense, when I say it doesn't change, it just accelerates the window of choice making. That whereas before you would make a choice and both sides were subject to constraints of time and space, and you had time to discuss it and regurgitate it, so to speak, and then the public didn't find out about it. Believe me, if CNN was on the beach at Normandy, it would have been a different war. But the people who are ordering the robotics, they're out somewhere outside of Las Vegas, for example. They have a Predator drone, and they're making decisions about whether to blow up somebody or not. That decision, even though it's instantaneous and it's done at a distance, is still the same decision. And there's going to be somebody who's going to have a counter drone, and there's going to be somebody who's going to say, wait a minute, these drones are just killing each other, and these robots, let's get at the human somehow who's ordering it or creating them. And at some point, if somebody has the ability, they're going to send a terrorist squad into Vegas to blow up that thing. I mean, that's going to be unchanging, because human nature is unchanging. And I think this is very important, because there's a lot of talk about nuclear disarmament in this administration, and I think that would be great. My problem with it is that they don't make the distinction that it's the tool. They think it's the tool, and I think it's the person or the nation that has the tool. We lost 1 million people to machetes in Rwanda. Nobody thinks that they want to outlaw machetes. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that more people have died from machetes than nuclear arms since Hiroshima. I'll even include Hiroshima. More people have died since 1900 from machetes and nuclear weapons. But nobody wants to outlaw machetes. And every time throughout history, somebody, if they were in Greek times, they wanted to outlaw missile weapons, or they wanted to outlaw catapults at the beginning of the Hellenistic period, or the church wanted to stop crossbows. especially arquebuses. All of these were mechanisms of killing people at random, where you wouldn't have face-to-face gallantry, or people of the lower classes killing knights. And every single universal globalized statute failed. After World War I, we said we'll never use poison gas again. The reason we didn't use it in World War II is both sides had it and said whoever uses it first is going to get a bigger gas attack in retaliation. It wasn't because of any Geneva Convention. The Egyptians used it in Yemen, and as we know, Saddam used it. So I think that all of these remind us that whatever the weapon is, whatever the robot is, whatever the latest sophistication, they are run by people, and people are subject to predictable patterns of behavior and predictable ways of deterring them. There's only one way to stop a person from using a weapon, or if it's a robot, make a better robot yourself, or have a robot and send them a message that if you use that robot, my robot's going to be much meaner than your robot.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you could comment on a couple of statements that have been made in history.
Yeah.
One was by Frederick the Great or Bismarck, I don't recall which, maybe you do, that conducting foreign policy without guns is like dancing without music.
Yes.
And also Ronald Reagan's statement of, I don't recall ever being attacked because we were too strong.
Well, I think we don't like some of these statements because they remind us that we have the suspicion that the people who are saying them not for instruction, but as chauvinistically or triumphantly, or because they have the greater weapon, and therefore they're saying that the weapons dictate reality. But it's not true. All of the Frederick the Great, Bismarck, Ronald Reagan, they all understood something, that what gets people killed, unfortunately, in wars are sophisticated, highly educated people who feel that their adversaries are just bystanders, operate on the same core principles that they operate on. But believe me, Barack Obama is an enlightened thinker who went to Occidental and Columbia and Harvard Law and taught at Chicago Law School. But he operates in a different landscape than Mr. Ahmadinejad, Mr. Chavez, Mr. Assad. When he went to Cairo and he gave that soaring speech where he really exaggerated American misdemeanors and played down the Islamic world's felonies and gave them credit for quite striking things, the Western Renaissance and Enlightenment, sophisticated Islamic medicine, tolerance in Cordoba during the Inquisition. All these were in some ways fabricated. And he did that because he wanted to reach out and say, look, I'm sophisticated, I'm empathetic, there's no reason for us to fight. And what he didn't understand is, in their way of thinking, there's a lot of reasons to fight. We feel that the West is decadent, that it's highly leisured, that it doesn't believe in anything. We've seen that in Europe. And we think that we can readjust the world map at your expense because you can't stop us. And even after the El Arabia interview, even after the Cairo speech, even after the euphemism overseas contingencies operations, man-made disasters, even after the promise to close down Guantanamo, even after the promise to try KSM, even after reading Mr. Mutalab his Miranda rights, where are we? We had more terrorist attempts in the 15 months of the Obama administration than every year prior until 2001. Because the enemy does not interpret that, as I said earlier, as magnanimity. They see it as weakness. And to admit that seems to Mr. Obama and his enlightened cohort to be a referendum on our own failure as civilized people. I think it's very dangerous when you have highly educated people who take it upon themselves to think what the enemy thinks. I think I know pretty much what bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri, they kind of remind me of some neighbors I had to farm next to. And the more that I promised them not to, I would say to them, please don't take the water. It's not your turn on the communal ditch. There's no reason for educated people like ourselves fighting over 3 days of ditch water. It makes no sense. And the reply I got more or less was, if you don't like it, stop me. And the only reason that they stopped stealing was when I was able to show them that it wasn't in their interest to do so.
Yes. It's interesting, like you say, that countries.
What? Can you hold that up? Yeah. Yes.
That countries supposed to be like united against this terror and war.
Yeah.
And it's in 1933, Hitler wrote a book, My Camps.
Yes.
In that book, you know, he said we will destroy and kill all Jews, all homosexuals, all Negroes,
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
And then Israel, what was a state, not a country this time, Golda Meir in her book wrote that to power some, you know, document to this power countries like United States of America, France, England, and some other countries. Non-country, yeah, and she wrote.
What's your
that
question, though?
my question is, why the United Nations not involved in just stop the war? What they're doing, I don't understand.
The United Nations
what they're
is not
doing.
new. It's a concept that evolved out of the League of Nations, and it evolved out of earlier European programs. There were even certain types of associations in the ancient world like it. But none of this works unless you have a global policeman. Because people will say, Italians do not go into Abyssinia. Japanese do not go into Manchuria. Saddam do not go into Kuwait. It means absolutely nothing. Especially when so many people in the United Nations, they vote only when they're in the United Nations. They surely don't vote back at home. They have no consensuality in their own societies or free press. So this idea that we're going to rejoin, I mean, we just heard that Iran is on the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. This is a country that stones women, who just said that the tsunamis and all these natural disasters are caused by women revealing themselves. So we have bad actors in the United Nations, and because the United Nations assumes that they're all rational and they're going to vote, and assumes that one vote from Iran is equal to a vote for France, it's not. And I have no qualms about saying that when Zimbabwe or Venezuela vote, that vote is not the same as a consensual society. And the UN has no mechanism for enforcing it. And it's a nice debating society, but it has not. The only two wars I think it even participated in a positive way were East Timor and Korea, and that one, Korea was because of the boycott of the Chinese. So I don't see any purpose other than to talk. And I wish the best thing we could do with the United Nations is stay in it and get the headquarters out of New York City and put it where it needs to be, in Zimbabwe or you know, Colombia or somewhere, and then all these diplomats would be away from the five-star restaurants and CBS, ABC, and they wouldn't get the attention. They could just go debate. But this idea that they're going to stop war is historically inaccurate.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you can prevent the.
No, you can't. Yes.
Welcome back, Santa
Thank you.
Cruz. I read recently where the Ottomans thrived by encouraging multiple cultures within their empire, and then by pitting them against each other, and thus preventing anyone from becoming very strong. Is there any truth to that?
Well, that's the famous divide and conquer aspect of the Romans, where if they went into Gaul or they went into Numidia, they always found one tribal leader to fight a Vercingetorix, or to fight a Mithridates, or to fight a Jugurtha, and they played both sides off. The British were experts at that in India. With a very, very small force, they were able to control India by having one prince fight another. And the problem with all of that is, in our post-enlightened age, we consider that cynical, realpolitik, unfair, whatever, even though it has a utility that's proven through time. So especially, we're not very good imperialists because we've never really had an empire. We haven't taken anybody's land since 1898 in the Philippines. So I don't think the United States is going to go into Afghanistan the way the British would have, or the Romans would have, and said, you know what, let's get the Pashtuns versus the Tajiks and get them all played off, and so there's a balance of power, and we're the broker. Because it's much more American to go in and say, you know what, we've got to make sure that they brush their teeth 3 times a day and they use an electric toothbrush, or they're going to have an unacceptable level of cavities.
What about within this country?
Yeah. Well, in this country, I'm a little worried. That's a whole different subject, but we have a pattern that this is the only multiracial, multi-ethnic country that of this size that has worked, and it's because it's not multicultural. It had a common constitutional system and a diverse racial makeup and one language. And everywhere where a multicultural system has been employed, whether it's in the Balkans or Rwanda or in the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire, it never works, because each side then makes claims on the public body and that can't be sustained or can't be granted. And so if we get to a situation where we're going to have an Asian American, a so-called white American, a Hispanic America, a black America, and each are making claims that their grievances trump the others, and there's no common language, there's no, Lincoln does not exist for everybody. A Hispanic says, I can't think Shakespeare is part of my heritage because he was white. Or some of us who happen to be white say, you know what, I don't like Martin Luther King, because when you get to that point, it won't work. We know it won't work. So anytime I hear somebody saying he wants a multicultural society, I think this is a prescription for suicide. And, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. I agree with you in terms of the Falklands. It was a war that really didn't need to be fought. Yes. It was a disaster, shall we say. But what I'm wondering, what is your opinion as a classical military historian in terms of the Iraq War? Did we really need to go in there in light of all the information that's come out in the last few years as to the cooked information?
You mean looking back at Iraq?
Yeah.
Do you think it was worth it?
Or was it worth it in terms of the methods they used for deciding to go in, which were very faulty in a lot of respects?
I think there were mistakes made, and the biggest one that I had, all the traditional so-called mistakes, I think can be reinterpreted, and there's good arguments on both sides. Disbanding the Iraqi army and turning a bunch of 18-year-olds loose with nothing to do was a mistake, but on the other hand, that army is now pretty much free of Ba'athist. That in the long run, that might have been wise. The idea that you're going to go in there and have a light footprint and try to get out as quickly as possible, the Casey Abizade idea versus the Petraeus counterinsurgency, I think you can see that in retrospect there's a lot to recommend the Petraeus support. The big mistake I think that's absolutely on question is that on October 11th, 10th and 11th, 2002, the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives voted in bipartisan fashion. Both motions carried the House and the Senate. In the Senate, a majority of Democratic senators, wonderful speeches by John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, that we needed to go in to take out Saddam because, writ 1, 2, 3, 23 of them, he tried to kill George Bush. He practiced genocide against the Marsh Arabs. He violated the UN Accords. He was harboring Abu Nadal and Abu Abba, all of these terrorists. He had attacked 4 of his neighbors. They were all there. Only 1, maybe 2, were about WMD. But this administration, the Bush administration, decided to privilege that one, and then it put all its eggs in one basket. Had it said, we're going to go in there because this is a homicidal, genocidal maniac who's destroyed everything he touches, and he's unstable when he's combined with petroleum, they probably would have had a coalition that would have lasted even if they didn't find WMD. But once you privilege WMD, it disappeared. And then when you try to make the argument, I mean, there was some utility. Libya, under Colonel Gaddafi, had an enormous WMD program. He gave it up. Pakistan's Dr. Khan was running a nuclear warehouse. He gave it up. Syrians were killing people in Lebanon. They were dominating. They got out. There were all these positive things. Try making that argument in 2005. You couldn't do it to the American people because they had been told that WMD, no WMD, it was not worth it. Now, was it worth it? That is going to be for historians to, on the one side, 4,000 tragic deaths of young people versus a constitutional society in the heart of the ancient caliphate that may or may not endure. If it endures, it's going to be a positive force in the region, and it will ironically check Iran in a way that we can't check Iran. Every day there is free broadcasting of Shia participating in consensual government going into Iran. It's one of the reasons Iran is being destabilized. But will that endure? We don't know. If it falls apart, no, the war wasn't worth it. If that government succeeds, it was worth it.
We have a question back here.
Our CIA estimates that Israel has between 175
Yes.
and 200 nuclear weapons. So how do you think Iran is going to destroy Israel?
Well, Iran's premise, why would they want 1 to 10 weapons when, as you say, Israel has over 175, and the ability, an Israeli missile is much more likely to find the target than an Iranian missile. Just like an Israeli software program is more likely to work than an indigenous Iranian program. But why would Iran then even want them, since the counter response would be overwhelming? And again, we get back to this idea of nuclear poker. The Iranians, better than we do, know that it's not nuclear weapons per se that matter. None of us lose sleep that Israel or France or Britain have nuclear weapons. We're terrified that Pakistan and North Korea do. They understand that. And they have already prepped the field, so to speak, by acting lunatic and telling everybody that they want to see a missing imam and they want to go to paradise and they don't really care. And go back and read about the Iran-Iraqi war, how we sent our young people as human bridges over minefield. We don't care. You want to live, we want to die and have paradise. They do all of that. And the net result is that they want to create a situation in which 10 nuclear weapons creates a greater threat, greater deterrent threat, because all 10 are more likely to be used in more scenarios than in the case of Israel. So what Israel, I think, is trying to do is to warn them that it's intolerable. And you start to hear a lot of Israelis say, 65 years after the Holocaust, we're not going to sit here while Europeans smile and make these empty gestures, why the half of the Jewish population of the world can be wiped out by this lunatic regime. They're not going to tolerate that. And so what they're trying to tell the Iranians in advance is this is what's going to happen. They're trying to deter them in advance. The problem that we have in the United States is that for one reason or another, in the last 8 years, countries that were bellicose, hostile to the United States versus countries that were friendly between 2001 and 2008, we've switched. It's almost as like this administration is saying, hey, you know Castro, hey, Chavez, hey, Assad, hey, Putin, hey, Ahmadinejad. I kind of understand why you didn't like the Bush administration. Hey, Colombia, why did you like the Bush administration? Hey, Israel, why were you friendly to us? Hey, Britain, why were you friendly to us? And so we flipped, and our allies are being treated as enemies, are ignored, and our enemies are being courted, and that's very dangerous because Iran and Venezuela and Syria almost think if I try something, there's going to be a certain degree of sympathy for me. I'm not saying it's explicit, but it's a very dangerous situation because we need to reestablish that if you're a democratic constitutional state and you're invested in the Western idea of commerce and globalization and constitutional government, then you get a little bit more attention than if you're a destructive, autocratic, dictatorial country like Venezuela or Syria or Iran. And unfortunately, that message has not gone out. And our enemies understand that, and they're looking around. It's 1979 all over again. We used to hear those soaring platitudes about we won't sell weapons, we don't want to be connected with the Argentine dictatorship. As a student, I used to love hearing that at Stanford. Then all of a sudden, we found out that all of the world's bad players thought, you know what? It's time for the Chinese to invade Vietnam. It's time for the Afghans to be invaded by the Russians. It's time to take hostages. It's time to go into Central America if you're the Soviet surrogates. And the world blew up, so to speak. Why? Because they thought the United States either could not or would not react. When you get to the situation that you have to be perfect to be good, then it's very, very dangerous. We have time for one more question. Yes.
I have a follow-up question on Iran. I've heard a bunch of different things. There's the liberals in Iran who want to turn it back into a Shah-like kind of place. I've heard a blockade. I've heard let Israel take care of it, let them bomb Iran. And there's a bunch more, I'm sure.
Yes.
Which would you think is the best method as far as, let's say, the West or particularly us?
I know what you mean is, which do you think would be the least bad?
Right, exactly.
Yes.
That's exactly
because there's no good ones.
Right,
and
exactly. So
I don't think you want Israel to do it. I'm worried about that for a variety of reasons. They don't have the sufficient Air Force to do it, or they could do it, but they're going to take a lot of losses given the sophisticated imported missile defense that the Iranians have. There's going to be people in Europe and people in the United States who are going to say, good, Israel bells the cat for us, and now we turn around and damn Israel as a provocative, preemptive power. We win both ways. I don't think any of us want Israel to fall into that situation. If you will just let the situation go on as it is, we're going to end up 10 years from now with a nuclear Saudi Arabia, a nuclear Egypt, a nuclear Syria. So what has to be done? What we need to do, we have about a window of 15 months at most. We need to be encouraging dissidents to take it to the next step. And if they get out on the street next time, we need Barack Obama, the man of the people, the charismatic leader who he promised, whom his supporters said can appeal to people across racial, national, post-racial, magnetic leader, a Mandela who happens to be an American. He can get out there on the barricades, so to speak, and galvanize those people and say, this is a dark age, Neanderthal, theocratic, evil regime that is killing homosexuals, it's killing women, it's killing minorities, it's anti-Semitic, it's just a bad regime. And Iran has a great history. It goes back to antiquity, and you've always been a sophisticated, enlightened people, and now it's time to reclaim your heritage. And he's got to say that all the time. And then we have to have a 15 to 16 month window in which he does that. At the end of that, when they're just about ready to go nuclear, then we're going to have to act. And I would imagine that if you're going to take out the facilities, you might as well take out the Republican Guard barracks, the Air Force, the whole bit. Because I think if you just take out the nuclear weapons, the people are going to say, wow, they took away our nationalist Persian bomb, even though they didn't like the regime. You take out the Republican Guard and the people who were killing the people, they're going to say, well, I don't like anybody attacking Iran, but at least they got rid of the people who brought us such misery. It's a bad, bad situation. And Bush administration didn't have any answers. And I think the Obama administration is a little bit more culpable because they think they have answers. And they've told us they have answers, and they have fewer answers. But we're dealing with, this is what happens when you are a postmodern president and you're dealing with a pre-modern dictator. It's not good. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Victor Davis Hanson is a Hoover Institution Senior Fellow and contributor to National Review magazine. Find out more at victorhanson.com. Today on Book TV's In Depth, noted feminist, author, and legal scholar Martha Nussbaum